Welcome back to the archive. Today we're going to dive into another one of my over-the-board games. This is round one from the 2021 National Open, which was in Vegas the other week. And this was my first game. I thought that I was going to have good chances in this section. I was rated, seeded around 2,000, even though my rating dropped a bit before this. And I was playing down in round one against Dimitri. And he was an not older gentleman, but older than myself. Definitely not a kid. And he had the black pieces. So we had a French defense. And my opponent played bishop to b4, the Winawer. And I enjoy this opening from both sides. It leads to very sharp games, so I was excited to see it. And we proceeded with the main line. Black gives up the bishop to mess up white's pawn structures, and one of the most trying moves in this position is queen to g4, going after the weak g7 pawn right away and allowing black to attack down the c-file. In this position, it's pretty normal for black to actually play knight to e7 and then queen to c7. If they play queen to c7 first, they can play knight to e7 and just transpose into what would be considered the main line here. But queen c7 first also allows this additional option of f5, hitting the queen right away and defending the g-pawn. This is not a great variation objectively for black. It leads to a lot of weaknesses in black's structure, but it is tricky, and if white's not prepared, black equalizes pretty easy and can have some initiative on the queen side. I've faced this a couple of times before, one other time over the board. And in that game, I played the move queen to h5 check. Black played g6, and I came back to h3 to defend the c-pawn. I ended up winning that game, but I wasn't super happy with my queen placement. So I actually went into a bit of a think here, even though it's early in the game, really to try and make sure that I placed my queen on the best square possible. And I eventually came up with queen to g3, keeping the pressure on g7 and guarding c3. We don't want to take en passant because black will retake with the knight, and that will allow them to develop with tempo. If I go anywhere else on the h-file, we are really relieving pressure on the g7 pawn, which would like to keep the queen tied to. And then I want to keep an eye on the c3 pawn because black's main idea in the Winawer French is to pressure c3 and go for this fork in a couple of different ways possible to undermine the center, go after c2. So my queen being able to keep an eye on that part of the board is very helpful. So queen g3 was played, and my opponent develops naturally with knight to c6, increasing the pressure on d4. And I went ahead and played bishop to b5. Now, this move, I thought probably wasn't the best move in the position. And sometimes you get that feeling where you want to play a move that you don't think loses, don't think is terrible, but you also have a feeling it's not objectively the best move. But I didn't really love the idea of playing knight f3 here. Knight f3, which is the main move, defends the d4 pawn, but it cuts the queen off, and it is a little bit unusual for the knight to be on f3 in this type of Winawer structure. Often the knight will end up on e2. You'll allow black to take on d4, and then you'll play knight e2, guarding c3 and hitting d4. But I didn't want to play knight e2 now either, because then I'm blocking this bishop. So I thought this pin on the knight could be useful because they don't really want to block with the bishop because of g7 being weak, and it'll allow my knight to come to e2 later. So I went ahead and played bishop to b5. Black captured on d4, and I proceeded with my plan of knight to e2. And black plays knight to e7, which defends this knight well, but offers up the g7 pawn. And I thought for a little while here, trying to decide whether or not I should take g7. And the decision is not whether I can get away with taking g7, because I think that in any of these lines I'm going to be able to safely capture the pawn. But the question is, how much play is black going to get against my king? Because if I take on g7 and they get to play the rook to the g-file, then I'm going to have to leave my king in the center for the remainder of the game. So I didn't love that idea. So even though I think I can take here, and the computer agrees, taking white has a strong advantage, I decided that instead I was just going to castle. Probably could take g7 later, but black has plenty of other weaknesses, so I went ahead and castled right away. And after I do that, black's best option is to just take on c3. And then I'll end up taking the c-pawn, and we'll have an unbalanced game where I'm going to try and play against the various weaknesses that black has. However, they played the move bishop d7, breaking the pin right away. And here, I might still be able to take the g-pawn, but they're just going to queenside castle, bring their second rook over, and they're going to get a lot of pressure on the king side. So I took this moment to capture back on d4 and solidify my pawn structure. So now it's really hard for them to undermine my pawn chain, especially once I play c3, because they don't have a c5 pawn break anymore. So they proceeded to kingside castle, which caught me a bit off guard, but I went ahead and played c3, just defending the pawn, and now white really has no weaknesses in the position, and black has this one weakness on e6 we're going to try and go after. Black plays knight a5. Knight a5 is a thematic move in the French where you're trying to get into these weak light squares, and also he's offering the bishop trade. So if I'm worried about this fork on b3, I can trade bishops and just play my rook to the b file. But that involves trading the bishops, and with their weak light squares, I wanted to go ahead and keep that bishop, so we backed up to d3. Black jumped in with the knight, and here I think any rook move will do. I went to a2, and this decision here by black I think is a mistake. Giving up that knight, it's now spent a whole bunch of moves traveling to take my bishop that has not moved yet. So I felt like I was up a significant amount of time. All my pieces are nice and developed. So we try and pressure the king side. Doesn't really go anywhere. In this position right here, I thought about jumping my knight into the g6 square, but the knights are just going to trade off. And then whether I capture with the pawn will be weak, or capture with the queen, no backup. I think I'm just giving up my good knight for their not so great knight. So I was kind of looking for a waiting move. I'm also thinking about playing the c4 push, trying to break it open, but I've got to do it at the right time so that their bishop doesn't become so good that it overshadows my attack on this diagonal. So we just back up to f1. My queen keeps an eye on c3, and I thought it was pretty hard for black to make any moves here. Maybe they try and double on the c-file, but the bishop can't really be improved, the knight can't be improved, the queen can't be improved because it's tied to e6. So I was pretty happy with this position, even if I'm not seeing anything concrete. And so he starts to double, and I felt like I can try to push c4, but giving him the ability to capture and then play something to d5 seemed like he was going to be able to hold things together. So maybe I need to build up that pressure more. I thought maybe I'd just go to the b file, double on the b file, and try and go after that. Possibility of just pushing the a pawn. Right now the bishop can capture, but maybe I can set something up in that regard. And then I saw an interesting idea that I thought could gain me a move in time. So I went ahead and played the move rook to c2. And my opponent, as expected, almost instantly played bishop to a4. Then I played rook to b2, and the bishop went back to c6. So let's back up a couple moves so we can see what happened there. So in this position, I have the option of playing rook to b2 right now. And we have this position on the board, and it's black's turn to move. But by playing rook to c2 first, we get this exact same position, except now it's white's turn to move. So I saved a move, got the same position, my turn again. So just a little trick. If he doesn't fall for it, my position's still fine. There's no problem with it, but this made things even easier. So now I play my rook to b4, and we're looking to double rooks. We're thinking about playing c4 with an extra protector there, and my big idea is to play a4 later on. Another thing I want to do is I'm considering moving this knight up to c5. If my knight ever gets to c5, their queen has trouble continuing to guard this pawn, has trouble continuing to guard the b7 pawn. But I didn't like his idea of playing b6. So I'd really like to shuffle my a pawn up to a5 to guard the b6 square before I start rerouting this knight. So we've got a4, a5 as a threat. We've got c4 as a possibility, and rook to b1 as a possibility, doubling on the file. None of this is going on the king side, but if he shifts everything over to the queen side to defend against these threats, I think I will have chances to jump into the g6 square and exert some more pressure. So my opponent doubles on the c file as expected, and I thought for a while here and decided that I could indeed play a4. The threat being that I play a5 and then get my knight to c5. And so I thought one option for my opponent was to play a5 here, at which point maybe rook to b6, try and get some more pressure on e6, and I thought my position was good there, good possibilities. Maybe my bishop even comes to b5 later on, and we're able to probably win e6 later on. But my opponent took on a4. And now we have a brief exchange sacrifice. I get my material back really quickly. We sacrifice the exchange. If the queen doesn't take back, black's just down a piece. And then we capture on e6, taking that most important pawn, threatening checkmate, and threatening the rook. So black plays knight c6. I capture the rook. He captures back. And in this position, we've got even material. I've got a slightly better pawn structure. Black's got a passed a pawn and a slightly weaker king. And when I talked to my opponent after the game, they thought they were pretty much fine in this position. Obviously, they're a little more passive if they have to stop this pawn. But I think black is doing okay if white doesn't find the next move, which is e6. Hitting the rook and also trying to create some more possibilities of using the light squares. Getting the queen in here, we might be able to win a piece by trying to promote. So e6 continues the initiative. And as long as white can continue the initiative, the position feels like it should be winning. And indeed, it is objectively winning at the moment. We're plus like 3.5. Because we're going to win the piece if they try and stop the pawn, or we're going to win all the pawns with check. So black backs up and defends the rook. If they play something like rook to e7, then my thought was that I can probably just start to bring the queen into one of these two squares. Maybe I start rerouting the bishop. Might even play c4 and try and get on the diagonal. I hadn't decided yet what to do if they blocked with the rook. Fortunately, they didn't spend very long and they played queen to a5. And here, white has a really nice tactic that I used to finish the game. I'll give you guys a moment to find it. You can pause the video if you want. See if you can find the move for white that finishes the game. Okay, and the move is rook to a1. Attacking the queen. And our rook looks undefended, but if the queen captures, we capture. And if they take the c-pawn, we have a couple choices. We can just push our pawn and win the piece, or we can play queen to f7, and we're going to win all of these kingside pawns with check, and then we'll push our pawn and win the piece. So a pretty easily winning position here for white. And so black decide they cannot take my rook. And so they played queen to b6. They have to stay attached to their rook. And now we go to b1. Same threat. Except now they're not even going to have the chance to capture my c-pawn. And we're going to get that same winning position. So they go back to a5. And then rook to b5 attacking the queen. Covering b6. And now black either has to give up the queen. Or if they save the queen, we get the rook for free. So a nice little tactic to finish. In this position, my opponent resigned. It was a relatively clean game by myself. We got an advantage out of the opening. We played precisely to get that edge early in the game, and we kept it and didn't allow too much counterplay. So I was really happy with my first game in the National Open, and I was looking forward to the rest of the games. So tomorrow I will go ahead and post round 2, and we'll continue from there. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions or improvements that you think could have been made in the game, or fun tactics or anything like that, go ahead and post in the comments. And tomorrow, game 2. Good luck in your games and your studies.